The night was a shroud, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of a drone circling somewhere above the shattered rooftops. In the ruins of a small Ukrainian village, a young combat medic named Olena crouched in the shadow of a crumbling wall, her breath shallow, her hands trembling as she clutched a blood-streaked bandage. The air smelled of ash and damp earth, and the distant thud of artillery pulsed like a heartbeat through the darkness. Her eyes wide with focus darted to the wounded soldier sprawled before her, his face pale under the faint glow of a flickering flashlight. His chest rose and fell unevenly, each breath a fragile thread tethering him to life. Olena's fingers moved swiftly, tying off the bandage around his leg, but her mind was a storm of fear and resolve. The drone's hum grew louder, closer, its mechanical whine cutting through the silence like a predator stalking prey. She knew what it meant. Any movement, any light could draw its deadly payload. Yet she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when the soldier's hand gripped hers, weak but desperate, his eyes pleading for her to stay. "Don't leave me," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. She pressed her back against the wall, her heart pounding as she scanned the sky for the drone's silhouette. The cold bit into her skin, seeping through her worn medic's vest. But it was the weight of responsibility that pressed harder. She was no stranger to war's chaos, but this moment felt different. Raw, suspended, as if time itself held its breath. She thought of her brother back in Lviv, his laughter, the way he'd tease her about her stubborn streak. She thought of the promise she'd made to her mother to save lives no matter the cost. The drone's hum faded for a moment, and Olena seized the chance. She leaned over the soldier, her voice low but steady. "Stay with me," she said, her words a mirror of his plea. She adjusted the tourniquet, her hands slick with sweat despite the chill. The soldier's name was Mykola, a farmer's son from a village not unlike this one, now reduced to rubble. She didn't know his story yet, but she knew his fight, his will to live, was her fight now, too. A sudden flash lit the sky, followed by a deafening crack. Olena flinched, her body curling protectively over Mykola as debris rained down. The drone had struck nearby, its explosion tearing through what remained of a nearby house. Dust clouded her vision, but she forced herself to focus, her hands moving on instinct, checking Mykola's pulse. It was faint but there. She whispered a prayer, not to any god, but to the strength within her, the strength she'd found in countless nights like this since the war began in 2022. How had it come to this? Just days ago, she'd been in a makeshift hospital, joking with her team about bad coffee and worse weather. Now she was here in the heart of a war-torn village, with only her medical kit and her courage to keep death at bay. The story of this night, this moment, began not with the drone's hum or the soldier's fading breath, but with a choice, one that had led her from the safety of a city to the edge of survival. The scene faded, the drone's hum lingering like a ghost, as memory pulled her back to the days before this night, to the moments that shaped her path to this battlefield. This story was inspired by real events and people. Some details have been fictionalized for emotional narrative purposes. Military geography, politics. The village, once a quiet cluster of homes nestled in Ukraine's Donetsk region, lay broken under a late autumn sky in 2022. Its name, too small to mark on most maps, had become a whispered word among soldiers, a place where the earth itself seemed to bleed. The war, now in its 9th month since the escalation in February, had carved deep scars across the landscape. Fields that once bloomed with sunflowers were now churned into mud, crisscrossed by tank tracks and littered with the husks of abandoned vehicles. The village sat on a low rise, surrounded by rolling hills that stretched toward the horizon, their gentle slopes deceptive in their calm. These hills hid snipers' drones and the constant threat of artillery, turning open ground into a deadly gauntlet. The air was sharp, carrying the bite of November's early frost. A thin layer of mist clung to the ground, curling around shattered trees and the skeletal remains of houses. The sky, heavy with gray clouds, seemed to press down on the world below, muffling sound and light. Rain had fallen the night before, leaving the ground slick and treacherous, each step a gamble against the mud's pull. The temperature hovered just above freezing cold, enough to numb fingers, but not enough to freeze the blood that stained the earth. Soldiers moved through this world in layers of damp uniforms, their breath visible in the chill, their faces etched with exhaustion and resolve. The broader conflict pulsed around this village like a living thing. To the north, larger cities like Bakhmut bore the brunt of relentless assaults, their names synonymous with endurance and loss. Here, in this smaller outpost, the fighting was no less fierce but less reported, a microcosm of the war's grinding reality. Both sides had dug in their positions, marked by trenches and makeshift fortifications. The Ukrainian forces, a mix of seasoned volunteers and conscripts, held the village's western edge, their numbers stretched thin, but bolstered by a stubborn will to protect what remained. Across the hills, their opponents, equally human, equally trapped in the war's machinery, maintained a loose perimeter, their movements shrouded by distance and the fog of war. No one spoke of politics here, not in the open. The soldiers didn't talk of borders or treaties of leaders or ideologies. Those things belonged to distant capitals, to voices on radios crackling with static. Here the world was reduced to survival, the next meal, the next hour, the next life saved. Yet the weight of the world's eyes was felt. Far-off nations sent aid supplies and words of support, their headlines, shaping narratives that felt detached from the mud and cold. The soldiers knew only what they saw: the faces of their comrades, the rhythm of their own heartbeats, the fleeting hope of a quiet dawn. Olena, the young medic, had arrived in this village 3 days earlier, part of a small medical unit dispatched to reinforce a battered front line. Her team's task was simple in theory: stabilize the wounded, evacuate them to a field hospital 30 kilometers west. In practice, it was a race against time, terrain, and the enemy's reach. The village's position made it a focal point for skirmishes, its elevated ground offering a vantage point both sides coveted. Artillery barrages came without warning, their blasts shaking the earth and sending shrapnel singing through the air. Drones like the one Olena had heard that night were a constant menace, their cameras and payloads turning every shadow into a potential threat. The Ukrainian unit numbered fewer than 100, a mix of infantry and support personnel, their equipment a patchwork of donated gear and aging Soviet-era supplies. They operated from a cluster of ruined buildings at the village's edge, their command post a former school now pocked with bullet holes. Across the hills, their opponents were less visible but no less present, their numbers unknown, but their firepower evident in the craters that scarred the landscape. Communication lines were spotty, reliant on radios that hissed and sputtered in the damp air. Supplies, bandages, morphine, food were running low, each delivery delayed by the same mud that slowed every movement. The weather was both ally and enemy. The mist hid soldiers from prying eyes, but also cloaked dangers, making every patrol a gamble. The cold preserved wounds from infection, but sapped strength, turning routine tasks into tests of endurance. Olena's medical kit, slung across her shoulder, grew heavier with each hour, its contents dwindling as the wounded arrived faster than supplies. Yet the landscape, for all its hostility, held moments of stark beauty, the way dawn's light broke through the clouds, casting gold across the frost, the silence of a snowfall, brief and fragile before the next shell fell. This was the world Olena stepped into, a place where time was measured not in days but in moments of survival. She had trained for this in a way, years in medical school, then months in makeshift clinics as the war spread. But nothing had prepared her for the weight of decisions made in the dark, with lives hanging in the balance. The village, with its broken homes and stubborn defenders, was her crucible now. As she moved through its ruins, her thoughts flickered to the life she'd left behind, a small apartment in Lviv, her mother's voice on the phone, the promise of a future beyond the war. But those thoughts were fleeting, drowned by the urgency of the present. The night of the drone, the night that would define her, was still hours away. For now, she was one among many, a figure in olive drab navigating a world of mud and mist, her purpose as clear as it was daunting: to keep her comrades alive. The village, the war, the world itself seemed to conspire against her. But Olena carried on, driven by a quiet strength that flickered like a candle in the dark. This story was inspired by real events and people. Some details have been fictionalized for emotional narrative purposes. Backstory and inner world. Olena Mikhailivna, 26 years old, was a daughter of Lviv, a city of cobblestone streets and golden church domes where the air carried the scent of coffee and history. Her dark hair, often tied back in a practical braid, framed a face that held both determination and a quiet vulnerability. Her eyes, a deep hazel, seemed to carry the weight of every life she'd fought to save. She wasn't tall, but her presence was steady like a tree rooted against a storm. She'd grown up in a small apartment above a bakery where her mother Helena kneaded dough with hands worn by years of labor. Olena's father had passed when she was a child, leaving behind a bookshelf of poetry and a love for words that she carried like a talisman. It was his voice she heard in her quiet moments, urging her to find meaning in chaos. Olena hadn't planned to be a combat medic. She'd studied medicine in Lviv, dreaming of a quiet practice, perhaps in pediatrics, where she could coax smiles from children. But the war, which had simmered in Ukraine's east for years, erupted into her life in February 2022. The news came in fragments, columns of armor cities under siege, lives uprooted. Olena volunteered within weeks, driven by a promise to her mother to save those who could be saved. She trained in makeshift camps, learning to stitch wounds under pressure, to carry stretchers through mud, to keep her hands steady when her heart raced. Her mother's parting gift was a small, embroidered cloth, a traditional Ukrainian pattern of red and black tucked into her medical kit. For courage. Helena had said, her voice breaking. Now, in the ruined village, Olena's inner world was a tightrope between fear and resolve. She missed the warmth of her mother's kitchen, the sound of her brother Taras playing guitar, the normalcy of a life uninterrupted. Yet she carried a stubborn hope, a belief that each life she saved was a step toward a future where war was only a memory. Her fear was real. Every drone's hum, every distant explosion reminded her of her own fragility, but it was matched by a deeper sense of duty. She saw herself in the soldiers she treated, young, frightened, yet clinging to something larger than themselves. Beside Olena was Seri, a wiry soldier in his early 30s, whose quick grin hid a well of grief. A mechanic from Kharkiv, he'd joined the army after his workshop was reduced to rubble in the war's early days. Serhi's hands, calloused from years of wrenching engines, now gripped a rifle, but his true skill was in keeping spirits high. He'd hum folk songs under his breath even in the darkest moments, and his knack for fixing broken radios or jury-rigging stretchers made him indispensable. Seri spoke little of his past, but Olena had glimpsed a photo in his pocket, a young girl, his daughter, now safe with her grandparents in Poland. Each night he'd trace her face with his thumb, a silent vow to return. Then there was Mykola, the wounded soldier Olena tended under the drone's shadow. A farmer's son from a village near Poltava, he was barely 20, his broad shoulders and quiet demeanor belying his youth. Mykola had enlisted out of a sense of duty to his land, the same fields his family had tilled for generations. He spoke of his mother's borscht, the way his dog would chase sparrows across the yard, small memories that anchored him. His dreams were simple: to plant sunflowers again, to see his sister marry. But war had made him a soldier, and now lying in the mud, his life rested in Olena's hands. His fear wasn't of death, but of being forgotten, of his story, fading into the war's vast silence. There was also Irina, the unit's radio operator, a sharp-eyed woman from Odessa with a voice like steel. At 28, she carried the weight of keeping the unit connected, her fingers dancing over dials despite the cold numbing them. Irina had been a journalist before the war, her words once capturing the vibrancy of her coastal city. Now she captured signals, each crackle a lifeline to the outside world. She hid her exhaustion behind dry humor, but Olena saw the way her hands shook when she thought no one was watching. Irina's dream was to write again, to tell stories of resilience, but for now her voice was the unit's pulse guiding them through the fog. These four, Olena, Serhia, Mykola, Irina, formed a fragile constellation in the village's chaos. They were not heroes in the cinematic sense, not larger-than-life figures, but ordinary people bound by extraordinary circumstances. Their inner worlds collided in shared glances, in the brush of hands passing a canteen, in the silence that followed a shell's roar. They carried their homes in their hearts, Lviv's streets, Kharkiv's workshops, Poltava's fields, Odessa's shores. They carried their fears too, of failing, of losing each other, of never seeing the dawn of peace. Olena's thoughts often drifted to her brother Taras, who had stayed in Lviv to care for their mother. She wondered if he still played his guitar, if he still believed in the future they dreamed of as children. Sari thought of his daughter's laughter, a sound he feared he'd forget. Mykola clung to the memory of his mother's voice calling him in from the fields. Irina dreamed of words that could heal, not just report. These private worlds, fragile and human, were what kept them moving step by step through the mud and cold. As the unit prepared for the night ahead, Olena felt the weight of their trust. She was their medic, their anchor, the one who would pull them back from the edge. But she was also one of them, a young woman who missed her mother's embrace, who feared the drone's hum as much as they did. In the quiet before the storm, she tucked the embroidered cloth deeper into her kit, a reminder of why she was here. The village, the war, the lives in her hands, they were all part of a larger story, one she was still learning to tell. This story was inspired by real events and people. Some details have been fictionalized for emotional narrative purposes. Movement. On the way to battle. The night was young, its darkness a heavy curtain over the Donetsk village, but the air thrummed with a restless energy. Olena adjusted the straps of her medical kit, the weight familiar yet oppressive against her shoulders. The unit had received orders just after dusk move to a forward position on the village's eastern edge, where a narrow road cut through the hills. Intelligence suggested a push was coming, movement in the distance, the low growl of engines, the faint chatter of radios, intercepted by Irina's keen ear. The mission was to hold the line to secure the road before dawn. For Olena, it meant preparing for the wounded for the chaos that would follow. The thought tightened her chest, but she pushed it down, focusing on the rhythm of her steps. The unit, a ragged column of 30 soldiers, moved through the village's ruins under a sky bruised with clouds. The mist had thickened, curling around their boots like a living thing, muffling the crunch of gravel and the clink of gear. Olena walked near the center, her medic's patch a pale mark against her dark jacket. Sari was ahead, his silhouette sharp against the dim glow of a distant flare, his rifle slung low but ready. Mykola, still mobile, then kept pace beside her, his broad frame hunched against the cold. Irina trailed at the rear. Her radio pack a hulking shadow, her voice a soft murmur as she relayed coordinates to the command post. The group moved as one, yet each carried a private world of thoughts, unspoken and heavy. The village was a ghost of itself, its houses reduced to jagged outlines. A child's bicycle lay twisted in a ditch, its red frame catching the faint moonlight. Olena's eyes lingered on it, a pang of memory pulling her back to Lviv, to children playing in the streets. She shook the thought away, focusing on the path. The road was a churned mess of mud and debris, forcing the unit to move slowly, their boots sinking with each step. The cold seeped through Olena's gloves, numbing her fingers, but she kept them flexed, ready for the work ahead. The air smelled of damp earth and something sharper, gunpowder perhaps, or the lingering trace of smoke from a recent strike. Sound was their guide and their betrayer. The wind carried fragments of noise, the distant bark of a dog, the low hum of a generator, the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. Each sound made Olena's heart lurch, her senses tuned to the possibility of danger. Drones were the worse their mechanical were, a constant threat, invisible in the dark. Serhiy, ever watchful, scanned the sky, his hand raised to signal a pause when the hum grew too close. The unit froze, crouching in the shadows of a collapsed barn, their breaths held, until the sound faded. Olena's pulse raced, her mind flashing to the soldiers she'd lose if she faltered to the promise she'd made to keep them alive. The march was punctuated by moments of eerie calm. At one point the clouds parted, revealing a sliver of moon that cast a silver glow over the hills. The light caught Mykola's face. His young features softened, almost boyish. He noticed Olena's glance and offered a small smile, the kind that spoke of shared burdens. "Reminds me of home," he whispered, nodding toward the fields. My sister used to chase fireflies on nights like this. Olena nodded, her throat tight. She wanted to ask more to hear his story, but the moment passed as Sari signaled to move again. The terrain grew rougher as they neared the forward position. The road dipped into a shallow ravine, its banks steep and slick with mud. The unit spread out, moving in pairs to avoid detection. Olena stayed close to Mikola, her medical kit rattling softly despite her efforts to secure it. Sari took point, his steps deliberate, his eyes scanning for tripwires or hidden threats. Irina's voice crackled through the radio, a low warning about movement spotted 2 kilometers east. The news tightened the air, each soldier's posture shifting, their hands tightening on weapons or gear. Olena felt the weight of her role more acutely. Now she was their lifeline, the one who would piece them back together when the world broke apart. A brief halt came at the edge of a copse of trees, their bare branches clawing at the sky. The unit gathered in a loose circle, their faces ghostly in the faint light. Sari passed around a canteen, the water cold but welcome. Almost there, he said, his voice low but steady, a mechanic's pragmatism cutting through the tension. Irina adjusted her radio, her fingers trembling slightly, not from cold, Olena knew, but from the strain of listening for threats in the static. Mikola leaned against a tree, his breath visible, his eyes distant. Olena wondered what he saw, his family's fields perhaps, or the sister he'd mentioned. She wanted to speak, to offer some comfort, but words felt inadequate against the night's weight. The final stretch to the position was a climb up a low hill, the ground uneven and littered with stones. The mist had lifted slightly, revealing the faint outline of the road they were to hold. It was a narrow strip flanked by fields on one side and a dense thicket on the other, a choke point both sides valued. The unit dug in, their movements practiced but weary, carving shallow trenches with entrenching tools. Olena found a spot near a fallen log, her medical kit open beside her, its contents arranged for quick access: bandages, tourniquets, morphine. She checked each item, her hands moving on instinct, her mind racing with what-ifs. As they settled in, the night grew quieter, the kind of silence that felt like a held breath. A flare arced high in the distance, its red glow painting the clouds, a reminder of the forces moving beyond the hills. Olena's thoughts flickered to her mother, to the embroidered cloth in her kit, to the life she'd left behind. She wondered if Taras was awake in Lviv strumming his guitar, or if her mother was praying for her safety. Sari nearby hummed a folk tune, the notes soft but defiant. Mikola, now crouched in a trench, stared at the road, his rifle resting against his shoulder. Irina's radio hissed, her voice a steady anchor as she confirmed their position with command. The tension was palpable, a shared pulse among the unit. Olena felt it in her bones, the anticipation, the fear, the unspoken hope that they'd see the dawn. She looked at her comrades, their faces etched with the same resolve and vulnerability she felt. They were strangers bound by circumstance. Yet in this moment, they were her family. The road ahead was a question mark, its answer hidden in the dark. But for now, they were together, their hearts beating against the night, waiting for what would come. This story was inspired by real events and people. Some details have been fictionalized for emotional narrative purposes. The battle begins. Twist and struggle. The silence broke with a sound like the world tearing apart. A low rumble, distant at first, grew into a roar, as artillery shells screamed overhead, slamming into the hillside beyond the road. The ground shuddered, sending dirt and stones cascading into the shallow trenches where Olena and her unit crouched. The air turned thick with dust, the sharp tang of explosives stinging her nose. She pressed herself against the earth, her medical kit digging into her side, her heart a frantic drumbeat. The flare's red glow lingered in the sky, casting an eerie light over the unit's position, turning faces into shadows of fear and focus. Olena's eyes found Mikola, his young face taut as he gripped his rifle, his knuckles pale. Sari, a few meters away, was already moving, his voice a low bark as he directed soldiers to their posts. Irina hunched over her radio, fought to keep the line open, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Command, "This is Sparrow. Shelling at our position. Request update on movement over." The radio crackled its response, lost in another explosion that shook the ground. Olena's hands trembled as she checked her kit, ensuring bandages and tourniquets were within reach. The battle had begun not with a clear line of advance, but with a sudden, disorienting fury. The unit's position was a fragile line along the road, their trenches shallow and exposed. The plan had been to hold the choke point to keep the road secure until reinforcements could arrive. But the shelling was heavier than expected, each blast closer, more precise. Olena's mind raced, piecing together the tactics the enemy was softening their defenses, probing for weaknesses before a ground push. She glanced at Seri, who met her eyes with a nod, his grin replaced by a grim determination. "Stay low, Doc," he called, his voice cutting through the din. "We'll need you soon." The first twist came with a crackle from Irina's radio. The static cleared just long enough for a frantic voice to break through. "Sparrow, be advised, drone activity confirmed." Multiple units closing fast. Olena's stomach dropped. Drones meant precision, meant eyes in the sky that could pinpoint their position. The units covered the trees. The mist was no match for thermal imaging. Serhi cursed under his breath, signaling the unit to spread out to minimize their exposure. But the road was narrow, the trenches limited. There was nowhere to hide. The hum came next, a mechanical whine that sliced through the artillery's roar. Olena's eyes darted upward, searching the dark sky, but the drones were invisible, their presence felt rather than seen. A soldier near Mikola fumbled with his gear, his breath ragged. Olena crawled toward him, her knees sinking into the mud, her voice low but firm. "Breathe. Stay with me." She didn't know his name, but she saw his fear a mirror of her own. She pressed a hand to his shoulder, grounding him, grounding herself. Then the unexpected, a sharp crack, not from artillery, but from a sniper's rifle somewhere in the thicket across the road. A soldier at the trench's edge slumped, his helmet rolling into the mud. Olena's heart stopped, her training kicking in before panic could take hold. She scrambled to him, her hands searching for a pulse, finding none. His eyes stared blankly at the sky, and she forced herself to look away to focus on the living. "Serhi," she shouted, her voice hoarse. "Sniper right flank." Serhi was already moving, directing two soldiers to lay down, suppressing fire, their rifles spitting light into the dark. The unit's response was swift, a testament to their training and trust. Mikola, despite his youth, held his position, his rifle steady as he scanned the thicket. Irina, still on the radio, relayed the sniper's location, her voice calm but urgent. "Command sniper at grid 4-2, engaging our position. Need support, over." The team worked as one, their movements a dance of survival. Cover fire, adjust. Olena crouched low, moved between trenches, checking for wounds, her hands steady despite the chaos. She felt the weight of every glance, every soldier looking to her for assurance that they'd make it through. The drones struck next, a sudden burst of light and sound as one dropped its payload 50 meters down the road. The explosion sent a shockwave through the unit, dirt and debris raining down. Olena's ears rang, but she pushed forward, crawling to a soldier, clutching his arm, blood seeping through his sleeve. "Hold still," she whispered, her hands moving quickly to apply a tourniquet. His face was pale, his eyes wide, but he nodded, trusting her. She worked in the dark, the flare's light fading, her flashlight a risky beacon she dared not use. The battle's rhythm was relentless, a cycle of noise and silence, action and waiting. The sniper fire slowed, but the artillery continued, each shell a reminder of their precarious hold. Seri's voice cut through, organizing a counter-push to secure the right flank. He moved with a mechanic's precision, his orders clear, his presence a steadying force. Mikola followed, his broad frame low as he darted between cover points, his fear buried under duty. Olena watched him go, a knot in her chest. He was too young for this, she thought, but so were they all. Another twist. Irina's radio went silent. The static vanished, replaced by a dead hum. She tapped the device, her fingers frantic, her face pale in the moonlight. "Lost signal," she hissed, her voice betraying a rare crack of panic. Without the radio, they were blind, no updates on enemy movement, no hope of calling for evacuation. Olena met her eyes, offering a small nod. "We'll manage," she said, though the words felt hollow. Irina nodded back, her jaw tight, and began troubleshooting the radio, her hands shaking, but determined. The unit adapted their teamwork, a fragile lifeline. Sari signaled for a small group to hold the road's center, while others reinforced the flanks. Olena stayed in the trenches, moving from soldier to soldier, bandaging wounds, calming fears. Each touch, each word was a defiance of the chaos around them. She thought of her mother's embroidered cloth tucked in her kit and drew strength from it. The night was a crucible forging them together. Olena's hands, Sari's commands, Mikola's courage, Irina's persistence. Then the moment that changed everything, Mikola's cry cut through the noise. He was hit, a bullet tearing through his leg as he moved to cover a retreating soldier. Olena's heart lurched as she saw him fall, his body crumpling into the mud. She ran to him, ignoring the whine of bullets, the drone's hum growing louder overhead. "Stay with me, Mikola," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her. His face was pale, his eyes wide with pain, but he gripped her hand, a silent plea. She worked quickly, applying pressure, tying a tourniquet, her hands slick with blood and mud. The battle raged on, but for Olena the world narrowed to Mikola's fading breath, to the fight, to keep him alive. Sari's voice called out, urging the unit to hold, while Irina's radio sputtered back to life, a faint signal breaking through. The drones circled closer, the artillery relentless, but Olena's focus was singular. She was their medic, their hope, and in this moment, Mikola was her world. This story was inspired by real events and people. Some details have been fictionalized for emotional narrative purposes. The sacrifice, decision, and turning point. The world was a blur of sound and shadow, the night torn open by the relentless drone of artillery and the high-pitched whine of drones circling above. Olena knelt beside Mikola, her hands pressed against the wound in his leg, the tourniquet slick with blood and mud. His face was pale, his breath shallow, but his eyes locked onto hers, a flicker of trust amid the pain. The road they'd fought to hold was now a crucible, the air thick with dust and the acrid sting of smoke. The unit's trenches were barely holding their shallow cover, no match for the barrage that shook the earth. Sarier's voice, hoarse but steady, called out orders, urging the soldiers to maintain their positions. Irina, her radio finally alive again, relayed desperate updates to command, her words clipped but unwavering. Olena's focus was absolute, her hands moving with the precision of instinct, tying off the tourniquet, checking Mikola's pulse. His grip on her wrist weakened, his fingers cold against her skin. "Don't let go," she whispered, her voice a lifeline in the chaos. She knew the wound was severe. A bullet had torn through muscle, possibly nicking an artery. Without evacuation, without a proper surgical team, his chances were slipping with every heartbeat. But evacuation was impossible now. The road was exposed, the drones overhead a constant threat, their thermal eyes scanning for movement. The nearest field hospital was 30 kilometers away, a distance that felt like a lifetime. The unit was pinned. The sniper across the thicket had gone silent, but the artillery hadn't, each shell landing closer, their blasts sending tremors through the ground. Sari crawled to Olena's side, his face streaked with dirt, his eyes sharp with urgency. "We can't hold much longer," he said, his voice low to avoid carrying. "They're pushing from the east. If we don't move, we're done." Olena nodded, her mind racing. Moving meant exposing themselves to the drones, to the unseen eyes waiting to strike. Staying meant risking annihilation by the next barrage. Mikola, barely conscious, was a weight they couldn't carry, not without risking the entire unit. The decision loomed heavy as the night itself. Olena's role as a medic was to save lives, but now she faced a choice that twisted her heart: stay with Mikola, risking her own life and the unit's safety, or retreat, with the others leaving him behind until help could come. She looked at him, his young face etched with pain, and saw the boy who dreamed of planting sunflowers, who spoke of his sister chasing fireflies. She thought of her own promise to her mother, to herself, to save those she could. But the unit was her responsibility too, their lives tethered to her hands as much as Mykola's. Irina's voice broke through, urgent and sharp. Command says no evac for at least an hour. Drones are too thick. Her eyes met Olena's, a silent acknowledgement of the impossible. Seri crouched lower, his hand on Olena's shoulder. We need you with us, Doc. If we lose you, we lose everyone. His words were practical, a mechanic's logic, but they carried a plea. Olena's chest tightened, her breath catching as she looked at Mykola. His eyes fluttered, his voice a faint rasp. Go, he said, barely audible. Hold on. The moment hung suspended like the pause before a storm. Olena's mind screamed against it, every instinct urging her to stay, to fight for Mykola's life. But the drone's hum grew louder, a second wave approaching their payloads, a death sentence for anyone caught in the open. Another shell hit closer now, the blast sending a shower of earth over the trench. Olena's hands shook as she secured Mykola's tourniquet one last time, tucking a morphine syringe into his hand. You keep fighting, she said, her voice breaking. I'm coming back for you. The sacrifice wasn't hers alone. Seri made the call, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying the cost. Fall back to the tree line, he ordered, signaling the unit to move. Irina packed her radio, her movements swift, despite the exhaustion etched into her face. The soldiers began to retreat, crawling through the mud, their silhouettes low against the flare-lit sky. Olena lingered a moment longer, her hand on Mykola's, memorizing his face. She left him with a blanket from her kit, a meager shield against the cold, and a whispered promise, I'll find you. The retreat was a desperate scramble, the unit moving in pairs, weaving through the sparse cover of the ravine. Olena's heart pounded, her eyes darting to the sky, expecting the drone's strike at any moment. Seri led the way, his rifle ready, his steps deliberate. Irina stayed close, her radio crackling with faint signals, her voice a steady thread, connecting them to hope. The unit reached the tree line, a cluster of bare oaks offering fragile cover. They regrouped, their breaths visible in the cold, their faces a mix of relief and guilt. Olena's hands were empty now, her medical kit lighter but her heart heavier. The turning point came not with a victory, but with a shift in resolve. As the unit caught their breath, Irina's radio sparked to life with a new transmission. Reinforcements were en route, a small convoy with air cover expected within the hour. The news was a spark in the dark, but it came with a cost. Mykola was still out there alone in the trench, his life fading with each passing minute. Olena's mind raced, her training clashing with her heart. She couldn't leave him, not after his plea, not after his sacrifice in telling her to go. She turned to Seri, her voice low but firm. I'm going back for him. Seri's eyes widened, his hand gripping her arm. It's suicide, Olena. The drones. She cut him off, her resolve unshakable. He's one of us. I won't let him die alone. Irina, overhearing, nodded, her face tight with respect. I'll guide you with the radio, she said, already adjusting her set. Seri hesitated, then released her arm, his grin returning faint but real. You're stubborn, Doc. Go. We'll cover you. Olena's decision was a quiet act of courage, born not of heroics, but of duty to a single life. She moved back toward the road, staying low, her senses attuned to every sound, the drone's hum, the distant artillery, the crunch of her own boots. The night was a maze of danger, but she navigated it with a singular focus. Mykola. She reached the trench, her heart lurching as she saw him still breathing, his face ghostly pale. She worked quickly, stabilizing him, her hands steady despite the fear. The drones circled closer, their whine a constant threat, but she ignored them. Her world narrowed to the rise and fall of Mykola's chest. The unit's cover fire echoed behind her, Seri and the others laying down suppression to keep the snipers at bay. Irina's voice crackled in her earpiece, guiding her through the dark. Olena dragged Mykola to a shallow ditch, her strength fueled by adrenaline, by the promise she'd made. The convoy's distant rumble grew louder, a faint hope on the horizon. Olena's hands never stopped, her voice a steady murmur as she kept Mykola conscious, telling him of sunflowers of home. The sacrifice Mikola's plea to let him go. Olena's refusal to abandon him changed the night's course. The unit held the tree line, their resolve strengthened by Olena's act. Mikola's life hung in the balance, but Olena's courage had bought him time, had bought them all a chance to fight another day. This story was inspired by real events and people. Some details have been fictionalized for emotional narrative purposes. Aftermath, the cost and silence. The night exhaled its fury, fading into an uneasy quiet as the artillery fell silent. The road, once a lifeline the unit fought to hold, was now a scar of churned earth littered with fragments of metal and the faint glow of dying flares. Olena knelt in the shallow ditch where she dragged Mikola, her hand still pressed against his wound, her breath visible in the cold air. The drones had retreated, their hum replaced by a distant rumble, the convoy finally arriving, its headlights cutting through the mist like hesitant stars. The battle was over, but its weight lingered heavy as the mud that clung to Olena's knees. Mikola's chest rose and fell, faint but steady, a fragile victory against the odds. Olena's hands slick with blood and dirt trembled as she checked his pulse again, her fingers finding the weak rhythm that tethered him to life. She whispered to him words of home and sunflowers, though she wasn't sure he could hear. The convoy's engines grew louder, and with them came the clatter of medics and soldiers, their voices sharp with urgency. Olena called out, her voice hoarse but clear, guiding them to the ditch. Hands lifted Mikola onto a stretcher, their movements swift but careful, and Olena followed, her legs unsteady, her heart caught between relief and dread. The unit, or what remained of it, gathered at the tree line where they'd retreated. Seri stood at the edge, his rifle slung low, his face a map of exhaustion and resolve. Irina, her radio pack discarded, sat against a tree, her hands still on the dials as if unwilling to let go. The soldiers were fewer now, their faces etched with the cost of the night. One was missing, the soldier felled by the sniper, his absence a silent wound. Olena felt it keenly, the weight of a life she couldn't save, a name she hadn't even learned. She pushed the thought down, focusing on the living, on the soldiers who leaned on each other, their breaths mingling in the cold. The village was a ghost in the dawn's first light, its ruins softened by a thin layer of frost. The air smelled of ash and damp earth, the ground pocked with craters, each one a testament to the night's violence. Shell casings gleamed faintly, scattered like fallen leaves, their cold metal a stark contrast to the warmth of the blood Olena had tried to stem. The road, their objective, was secure, for now held by the arriving reinforcements who fanned out to establish a new perimeter. But the victory, if it could be called that, was hollow. The village was no closer to being whole, its home still broken, its fields still scarred. Olena stood at the ditch's edge, watching as Mikola was loaded into the convoy's medical van. A medic, older and weathered, gave her a nod, his eyes carrying the same fatigue she felt. "He's got a chance," he said, his voice gruff but kind. Olena nodded back, her throat too tight for words. She clutched her medical kit, its contents nearly spent, and felt the embroidered cloth inside a quiet anchor. She thought of her mother's hands, stitching it, of the promise she'd made to save lives. Tonight she'd kept that promise, but the cost was carved into her bones. Serhi approached his steps heavy, his grin absent. "You did good, Doc," he said, his voice low. He didn't mention the soldier they'd lost, but his eyes carried the weight of it. Olena met his gaze, seeing the mechanic from Kharkiv, the father who carried a photo of his daughter. "We all did," she replied, her words soft but firm. They stood in silence, the dawn's light casting long shadows across the road. Irina joined them. Her radio silent now, her face pale but resolute. She didn't speak, but her presence was enough a reminder of the thread that had kept them connected through the night. The aftermath was not in numbers, how many shells fell, how many lives were lost or saved, but in the quiet moments that followed. The soldiers shared a canteen, the water cold and metallic, a small act of communion. One hummed a tune faint and familiar, echoing Serhi's folk songs from earlier. Another stared at the horizon where the hills met the sky, perhaps seeing a home he might never return to. Olena watched them, her heart heavy with their stories, their dreams, their fears. She thought of Mikola now in the hands of others and prayed he'd see his sunflowers again. The convoy's departure left a void, its rumble fading into the distance. The unit was ordered to hold the position until further notice, their trenches now reinforced by the newcomers. But the fight had drained them, leaving a stillness that felt both fragile and profound. Olena walked the road, her boots crunching against the frost, her eyes tracing the path they'd fought for. A single boot lay abandoned, its laces tangled in the mud, a relic of the night's chaos. She didn't pick it up, but its presence lingered, a quiet reminder of the lives that had crossed this road. The sky lightened, a pale gray that promised no warmth. The mist began to lift, revealing the full extent of the village's wounds: collapsed roofs, shattered windows, a church spire leaning precariously. Olena's gaze settled on a small garden, its flowers trampled but not gone, their petals clinging to life. She thought of her brother Taras, of his guitar, of the way he'd find beauty in broken things. She wondered if he'd write a song about this, about a medic who refused to let go, about a night that changed them all. The unit's silence was not defeat, but survival. They had held the road, had kept each other alive, had carried their burdens through the dark. Olena felt the weight of it. The lives saved the lives, lost the lives, still hanging in the balance. She thought of Mikola's whispered plea, of Serhi's steady commands, of Irina's voice cutting through the static. They were her family, now bound by a night that would live in their bones forever. As the dawn broke fully, Olena sat in the trench, her hands resting on her kit. She pulled out the embroidered cloth, its red and black threads catching the light. She traced its patterns, her fingers steady now, and felt a flicker of hope, not for an end to the war, but for the strength to face another day. The village, the road, the unit. They were all part of a larger story, one written in moments of courage and loss, in the quiet that followed the storm. This story was inspired by real events and people. Some details have been fictionalized for emotional narrative purposes. Message to viewer. The dawn had fully broken over the Donetsk village, its light pale and unyielding, casting long shadows across the scarred earth. Olena sat on a broken crate near the trench, her medical kit at her feet, its contents spent, but for the embroidered cloth tucked inside. The air was still, the frost beginning to melt under the sun's tentative touch, leaving the ground slick and gleaming. The road, now secured by the reinforcements, stretched into the distance, a silent witness to the night's ordeal. The unit was scattered, some tending to gear, others staring blankly at the horizon, their faces etched with the weight of survival. Olena's hands rested in her lap, her fingers tracing the calluses earned through countless nights like this one. She pulled the cloth from her kit, its red and black threads vibrant against the gray of the morning. It was her mother's gift, a piece of home that had traveled with her through mud and chaos. She held it to her cheek, its texture soft but grounding, and closed her eyes. In that moment she was back in Lviv, in the apartment above the bakery, the smell of fresh bread mingling with her mother's laughter. She saw her brother Taras, his guitar propped against the wall, his teasing grin as he called her Doc long before she earned the title. The memory was a fragile thing, a flicker of warmth against the cold reality of the war. Olena's thoughts turned to Mikola now in the field hospital, his life still hanging in the balance. She hadn't heard news yet, but she clung to the medic's words. He's got a chance. She imagined him waking to see his sunflowers, his sister's smile, the fields of his childhood. She thought of Serhi, who had slipped her a piece of hard candy during the convoy's arrival, a small gesture of camaraderie that spoke louder than words. She thought of Irina, whose steady voice had been their lifeline, now silent, as she wrote in a small notebook, perhaps capturing the night for the stories she'd one day tell. The war was a vast, unyielding machine, its gears grinding across cities and villages' lives and dreams. Olena had seen its face in the wounded, in the ruins, in the eyes of her comrades. But she had also seen its opposite, the stubborn will to live, to protect, to hold fast to what made them human. The night had been a crucible forging bonds that no shell could break. It wasn't about victory or defeat, those words belonged to maps and headlines. It was about the hands that reached for each other in the dark, the voices that refused to fall silent, the promises kept against all odds. She opened her eyes, the cloth still in her hands, and looked at the village. The church spire, leaning but unbroken, caught the morning light, its cross a quiet defiance. A bird small and gray darted across the road, its wings a blur of motion. Life persisted even here in the shadow of war. Olena thought of the soldiers she'd treated, their names and faces, a litany in her mind. She thought of the one she couldn't save, his helmet, still lying in the mud, a ghost she'd carry forever. The weight was heavy, but it was hers to bear, a testament to the lives she'd touched, the lives that had touched her. Olena pulled a small notebook from her kit, its pages worn and smudged. She began to write, her handwriting uneven but deliberate, a letter she might never send. "Dear Mama," she began. "I don't know if I'll ever find the words to tell you what this night was. I saved a boy who dreamed of sunflowers. I lost a man whose name I never knew. I found strength I didn't know I had, and fear I'll never shake. But I'm still here, still fighting because of you, because of home." She paused, her pen hovering, then added, "I carry your love with me, always." The letter was her anchor, a way to make sense of the chaos, to give shape to the formless. She wrote of Sari's grin, of Irina's voice, of Mikola's courage. She wrote of the road, the drones, the frost that clung to her boots. She didn't write of glory or triumph, those were hollow words here. She wrote of the small things, the taste of shared water, the sound of a folk song, the feel of mud under her nails. These were the truths of war, the human truths that no headline could capture. As she closed the notebook, Olena felt a shift, a quiet clarity. The war was not her story alone. It belonged to every soldier who'd stood on that road, to every hand that had reached out in the dark. It belonged to the village, its broken home still holding memories of laughter and love. It belonged to the people watching, listening, hoping for a world where such nights were no longer needed. She tucked the cloth back into her kit, her resolve renewed. She was a medic, a daughter, a sister, a keeper of promises. And she would carry on. To those who would hear this story, Olena's night was a mirror reflecting the cost of war and the strength it demanded. It was a call to see the humanity in the chaos, to honor the courage of those who faced the unthinkable. What does it mean to stand in the dark, to choose life over fear, to hold fast to hope when all seems lost? These were the questions she left behind, not as answers but as invitations to feel, to think, to remember. The village stood quiet now, its scars softened by the morning light. Olena rose, her kit slung over her shoulder, and joined her unit. They were battered but unbroken, their faces turned toward the next task, the next dawn. The war would continue, its shadow long and unyielding, but so would they. And somewhere in a hospital bed, Mikola might open his eyes to see the sun, to dream of sunflowers once more. This story was inspired by real events and people. Some details have been fictionalized for emotional narrative purposes.